The encounter. The city was alive with the hum of traffic, people bustling along the streets as they moved between the towering glass buildings that made up the downtown core. Officer Daniel Stone, a veteran of the city's police force, cruised slowly in his patrol car, the monotonous routine of the day barely making a dent in his psyche. He had worked this beat for over a decade, and in that time, he had developed a sharp sense of authority. The uniform gave him power. The badge on his chest symbolized law and order, and he had long since come to believe that his word was the final one. It was a slow afternoon, but as Daniel took a familiar turn into Pine Hills, one of the wealthier neighborhoods in the city, he felt his mood shift. Pine Hills wasn't part of his regular patrol, but today he felt like surveying the lavish streets lined with sprawling homes, meticulously groomed lawns, and cars that cost more than his yearly salary. As he idly drove, a sleek, black luxury sedan caught his eye. The car moved at a pace slightly over the speed limit, but it wasn't the minor infraction that grabbed his attention. It was the driver. Behind the wheel was a black woman, well-dressed and composed, effortlessly steering the car through the upscale streets. Something in Daniel's mind clicked. A familiar prejudice script began to play. He watched her for a few more moments, his hands gripping the wheel as his thoughts raced. There was no legitimate reason to pull her over, but he convinced himself otherwise. What was she doing in this neighborhood? Did the car really belong to her? His assumptions, fueled by bias, spurred him to flip on his lights and pull her over. The woman slowed down and pulled her car to the side of the road. Daniel parked behind her, taking a deep breath before exiting his vehicle. The sun gleamed off his badge, and as he approached her window, he adopted the swagger of authority he had long since mastered. He rapped his knuckles on the window with a deliberate force. The woman glanced up at him, her face calm and unbothered. She rolled the window down with a soft whir. "License and registration," Daniel barked, his voice sharp, layered with the arrogance he wore like armor. The woman glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Her poise was unsettling, her movements slow and measured as she reached for her documents. She handed them to him without a word, her hand steady, her gaze never wavering. Daniel took the documents and looked them over, scanning for any hint of fraud or anything that would give him the upper hand. When he found nothing suspicious, his irritation grew. He wanted to make her uncomfortable, to remind her of her place. "Nice car," he said, his tone thick with condescension. "Are you sure it's yours?" The woman didn't flinch. She stared back at him with an unwavering calm that sent a flicker of unease through Daniel, though he quickly suppressed it. "Yes, it's mine," she said firmly. "I bought it with my own money." Her word hung in the air, a simple statement, but one that seemed to challenge him in a way he hadn't expected. Daniel felt a surge of frustration. Her composed demeanor wasn't what he was used to in these situations. He wanted her to be flustered, nervous, submissive, yet she remained cool and composed, as if she knew something he didn't. "And where exactly are you heading?" Daniel pressed, determined to shake her calm exterior. "I'm going home," she replied. "I live just down the road." Daniel glanced in the direction she had pointed, but the street remained quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, his mind churned with prejudiced thoughts. He stepped back from the car, his eyes narrowing as he tried to find something, anything, that would justify his continued harassment. But the woman simply sat there, her gaze steady, as if she knew that nothing he could say would rattle her. "So, what do you do for work?" Daniel asked, changing tactics. "I'm an attorney," she said, her voice smooth but direct. "I work at Benson and Leon." The name dropped like a hammer in Daniel's mind. Benson and Leon was one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, and as the realization sank in, Daniel felt his confidence begin to slip. He had been expecting a much different answer, something that would confirm his assumptions, something that would justify his treatment of her. Instead, she was not only in control of the situation, but she seemed to be someone of significant standing, someone with resources. He stared at her for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. There was nothing about this encounter that was going the way he had imagined. His authority felt flimsy in the face of her calm confidence. "Well, I'll be keeping an eye on you," Daniel said finally, a weak attempt to regain control. He handed back her documents, feeling the heat of embarrassment creep up the back of his neck. The woman took them and placed them back in her purse with deliberate grace. "Thank you, officer," she said, her tone neutral but with an underlying strength that unnerved him. "I'll be on my way now." Without waiting for his response, she rolled up her window and started the car. Daniel stepped back, watching her drive away, his hands clenched at his sides. The encounter left him with a strange, unsettled feeling, as though the power he had taken for granted had been stripped away in the span of a few minutes. He stood there for a few moments longer, his mind racing. Something about the way she looked at him, the way she handled herself, stuck with him. She wasn't rattled or intimidated. In fact, it seemed as though she knew something he didn't, something that would come back to haunt him. As he climbed back into his patrol car, his thoughts were clouded with a lingering frustration. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that it was just another routine stop, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. The encounter had struck a nerve, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. By the time his shift ended, Daniel couldn't get her out of his head. He arrived home late, greeted by the quiet of his empty house. His wife, Sarah, barely looked up from her book when he walked in, their marriage long since having slipped into a comfortable silence. Normally, Daniel would have shrugged off the day's events and buried himself in the dull routine of the evening, but tonight was different. That woman, her face, her calm, her unflinching gaze, haunted him. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the interaction in his head over and over. And as sleep eluded him, an uneasy feeling settled into his bones. The next morning, when Daniel arrived at the station, the unease from the night before had only grown. He greeted his colleagues with a nod and went straight to his desk, trying to focus on his reports. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman in the luxury sedan. He couldn't shake the feeling that there would be consequences for what had happened. His instincts were right. Just as he began to settle into his routine, the voice of his new boss, Captain Marcus Lee, echoed from across the room. "Stone, my office, the reckoning." Officer Daniel Stone's pulse quickened as he heard Captain Marcus Lee's voice call his name. He knew the new captain well by reputation, a man who commanded respect through fairness, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Lee had only recently been promoted, replacing a more lenient superior who Daniel had managed to slide things past over the years. But Captain Lee was different. The whispers around the precinct spoke of a man who didn't tolerate any misconduct and who had a sharp sense of right and wrong. As Daniel made his way to the captain's office, the memory of the woman from the previous day gnawed at him. His instincts told him that this summons had something to do with her. The casual harassment he thought nothing of at the time now loomed in his mind as a critical mistake. Could she have filed a complaint? Would Lee take her word over his? With his heart hammering in his chest, Daniel knocked on the door and heard the familiar deep voice beckon him in. "Come in." He opened the door to find Captain Lee seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable, the blinds behind him casting slatted shadows across the room. The office had a distinctly formal air, more so than the rest of the precinct, with framed commendations lining the walls and a single photo of Lee and his family resting on his desk. Daniel's eyes flickered toward the photo for a split second, but what he saw made his heart nearly stop. It was her. The woman from yesterday. The woman who had looked at him with such calm, unwavering composure. The woman whose luxury card he had demeaned and whose life he had attempted to scrutinize without cause. She was smiling in the photograph, standing beside Captain Lee and a young boy, likely their son. Suddenly, the ground beneath Daniel felt as if it had shifted. His entire body tensed, and he struggled to keep his expression neutral. But inside, his mind was spinning. He was reeling. "Sit down, Stone," Lee said, his voice level but firm. Daniel obeyed, lowering himself into the chair opposite the captain's desk. He fought to steady his breathing, forcing his racing heart to calm, but the image of that family photograph was burned into his mind. He had pulled over the wife of his commanding officer, and from the way Lee's gaze bore into him, he knew his superior was fully aware of it. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Captain Lee finally spoke. "Do you remember the traffic stop you made yesterday in Pine Hills?" Daniel swallowed hard, trying to buy himself time. His mind raced as he considered his options. Should he admit fault and hope for leniency? Or should he try to justify his actions and play it off as routine? "I do, sir," Daniel finally replied, his voice wavering slightly. It was a routine stop. Lee's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a sign that the captain wasn't in the mood for evasiveness. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Routine," Lee repeated, his voice calm but carrying a weight that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "Tell me, Stone, what exactly about that stop was routine? You pulled over a woman who was driving her own car, had all her documents in order, and was minding her own business. Explain to me what was so routine about that." Daniel's mind raced for a response, but every excuse he considered sounded weak, even to himself. He knew he had no real justification. He had stopped her because of his own prejudice, his own unspoken biases that he had let guide his actions. He had seen a black woman in a luxury car and assumed she didn't belong. "I thought she was speeding, sir," Daniel finally said, his voice faltering under the weight of Lee's gaze. "She was going slightly over the limit." Lee's expression didn't change. He simply stared at Daniel for a few moments, as if weighing every word. "Is that so?" Lee asked, his tone cold. "Tell me, Stone, do you often pull over people for minor speeding infractions in Pine Hills? Or was there something else that made you suspicious of her?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He knew the truth, and he had a feeling Lee did too. The captain didn't need to hear Daniel say it out loud. His silence was enough. Lee sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a steely resolve in his eyes that made Daniel feel small, insignificant. "The woman you pulled over yesterday," Lee began, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority, "is my wife." The words hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. He had expected it, of course, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all the more real. His stomach dropped, and a wave of nausea swept over him. He had crossed a line that no amount of excuses or apologies could fix. "And she told me exactly what happened," Lee continued, his voice never rising, never betraying the anger that Daniel knew was simmering beneath the surface. "She told me about the way you questioned her, insinuated that the car didn't belong to her, and how you implied that she didn't belong in this neighborhood." Daniel's throat went dry. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. How could he? He had been caught, and there was no escaping the consequences now. "Officer Stone," Lee said, his tone hardening, "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my department. We are here to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate. You think because you wear that uniform, you're untouchable, that you can treat people however you want without facing any consequences." Daniel's heart was pounding now, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. He knew what was coming next. He had seen officers lose their jobs for less. The room seemed to close in on him, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. "I should fire you on the spot," Lee said, his voice laced with controlled fury. "You disrespected my wife. You abused your authority. And I don't care what your excuses are. There's no place for that in this department." Daniel's mind raced as he processed Lee's words. Fired. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was about to be destroyed, all because he had let his own prejudices guide him. But then, to Daniel's surprise, Lee leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing as he fixed Daniel with a piercing stare. "But I'm not going to fire you," Lee said, his voice low but filled with warning. Not yet. Daniel blinked, the words taking a moment to register. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Why wasn't Lee firing him? What was the captain planning? You're on thin ice, Stone, Lee continued, his voice sharp. I'm giving you one chance. One. To prove to me that you can do your job the right way. If you slip up again, if I hear even the slightest complaint about you, you're done. Do you understand me? Daniel nodded quickly, the knot in his stomach loosening ever so slightly. He had been spared for now, but the warning in Lee's voice was clear. This was his last chance. Yes, sir, Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand. Good, Lee said, standing up from his desk. Now get out of my office, and don't make me regret this decision. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He stood up, his legs shaky beneath him, and quickly left the office, the door closing with a soft click behind him. He walked down the hallway, his mind still reeling from the conversation. He had narrowly escaped the full consequences of his actions, but he knew that his every move would be watched from now on. And more than that, he knew that Captain Lee would not hesitate to bring the hammer down if he made another mistake. As Daniel returned to his desk, the weight of the encounter settled heavily on his shoulders. He had gotten away with it this time, but he was far from safe. The road ahead was uncertain, and the memory of that woman's calm, unflinching gaze still haunted him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a new fear took root. The fear that this wasn't over. The aftermath. The door to Captain Lee's office had closed behind Daniel with a soft click, but the weight of the conversation still hung heavily on his shoulders. As he walked down the corridor toward his desk, the noise of the bustling precinct faded into a dull hum in his ears. He had escaped being fired, but the reprieve felt more like a temporary stay of execution. Daniel sat down at his desk, his mind racing. His colleagues moved around him, engaged in their own tasks, oblivious to the inner turmoil that churned inside him. For years, he had worn his badge with a sense of pride, of power. He had wielded it with a confidence that often edged into arrogance, believing that his position protected him from scrutiny. But now, everything felt different. The unshakable certainty he had once held in his authority had crumbled in the wake of his encounter with Captain Lee. For the next few hours, Daniel tried to focus on his work, sifting through reports and typing up notes, but his concentration was shattered. The image of Captain Lee's wife, poised and composed during the stop, kept flashing through his mind. Her face had shown no fear, no anger, just an eerie calm, as if she knew she was untouchable, while he had been the one trying to assert dominance. And now she had all the power, her words holding the key to his downfall. He glanced up from his computer, his eyes scanning the room. His fellow officers carried on as usual, some chatting about last night's football game, others deep in paperwork. No one seemed to notice the storm that had been brewing around him. For a moment, Daniel wondered how many of them had been in similar situations, on the edge of losing everything because of a single moment of bad judgment. How many had survived it, and how many had fallen. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel's phone buzzed on his desk. It was a message from Sarah, his wife, reminding him of their dinner plans that evening with some friends from her work. He groaned softly under his breath. He had forgotten about the dinner entirely, and the last thing he wanted now was to sit through awkward small talk while pretending everything was normal. But avoiding it wasn't an option. Their marriage had already been teetering on the edge for years. Sarah's dissatisfaction had grown increasingly apparent, though neither of them ever voiced it. Instead, they carried on like actors in a play, performing their roles as husband and wife without really engaging with each other. And tonight, Daniel would have to put on another performance. He quickly typed a response, assuring her he'd be there on time, then tossed his phone back onto the desk. His thoughts, however, didn't linger on his failing marriage for long. They drifted back to Captain Lee, to his warning, and to the fragile thread that now held Daniel's career together. Suddenly, A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, Stone." Daniel looked up to see Officer Rick Jacobs, one of his closest colleagues, leaning against the edge of his desk. Rick had been with the force for almost as long as Daniel, and was known for his easygoing nature and sharp wit. But today there was something different in his eyes, something that made Daniel's stomach tighten. "Yeah," Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "You all right, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel forced a laugh. "Nah, I'm good. Just a long day." Rick didn't seem convinced. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to Daniel, lowering his voice. "Listen, I heard Captain Lee had you in his office earlier. What was that about?" Daniel hesitated, unsure of how much he should reveal. The last thing he needed was rumors spreading through the precinct about his run-in with the new boss. It was nothing. Just some routine stuff. Rick raised an eyebrow. "Routine? Come on, man. You don't look like it was routine. What really happened?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind scrambling for a way to brush Rick off without raising further suspicion. But before he could say anything, Rick leaned in closer, his tone dropping even further. "Look, I'm only asking because there's been talk going around about Lee. He's not like the old captain. He's different. You know what I mean." Daniel frowned, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "What do you mean, different?" Rick glanced around the room, making sure no one was within earshot before continuing. "I've heard he's got some kind of agenda. Don't know the details, but a couple of the guys said they think he's looking to clean house. Anyone who doesn't fit his standards, or who's crossed a line, he's coming for them." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. He had already felt the pressure of Lee's watchful eye, but hearing it confirmed by Rick made it all the more real. If Lee was out to clean house, Daniel's days were numbered. He had made a mistake, and it was only a matter of time before Lee found a reason to push him out for good. Daniel leaned back in his chair, trying to keep his face neutral, but inside, his mind was racing. He had to be careful. Every step from here on out would be scrutinized. Every decision would be a potential landmine. "Thanks for the heads up," Daniel said, keeping his tone casual. "I'll keep that in mind." Rick gave him a nod and stood up, clapping him on the shoulder. "Just watch your back, man. Lee's a stickler for protocol, but he's also not afraid to bend the rules to get what he wants." With that, Rick walked away, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts once again. The sense of unease that had been simmering since his meeting with Lee now surged to the forefront of his mind. This wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It was about survival. Later that evening, Daniel drove home with a cloud of dread hanging over him. The dinner with Sarah's friends was looming, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He kept replaying Rick's words in his mind. Lee was cleaning house. That meant Daniel needed to be perfect. No more mistakes. No more crossing lines. He pulled up to the house he shared with Sarah, the small suburban home they had bought together shortly after their wedding. It was a far cry from the lavish houses in Pine Hills, but it was comfortable. At least it had been, once. Now the house felt more like a battleground, with each conversation between him and Sarah feeling like a calculated maneuver designed to avoid an all-out fight. When Daniel stepped inside, Sarah was already waiting, dressed for the dinner party, her eyes scanning him with mild impatience. "You're late," she said, her tone clipped. "Sorry," Daniel muttered, kicking off his shoes. "Work ran over." Sarah didn't reply immediately. She just gave him a long, assessing look. "You're acting strange," she finally said. "What's going on?" Daniel sighed. He didn't have the energy to explain everything that had happened, nor did he think she'd fully understand if he did. Their relationship had become too strained for that kind of openness. Instead, he gave her a half-hearted smile. "Just work stress. Nothing to worry about." Sarah didn't seem convinced, but she let it drop. "Well, we need to leave soon. Are you ready?" Daniel nodded, though his mind was still far from the dinner party they were about to attend. He changed into more formal clothes and joined Sarah by the door, his thoughts a swirl of anxiety and dread. As they drove to the restaurant, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. He had dodged a bullet with Captain Lee, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. His every move would be watched from now on, and if he made one more mistake, just one, his career would be over. And then there was the affair with Claire. Daniel clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He hadn't thought about her in days, but now, in the silence of the car, the guilt resurfaced with a vengeance. Claire, the wife of a fellow officer. The affair that had once felt like a thrilling escape now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. If Lee ever found out about that, it wouldn't just be his career that ended. It would be everything. He glanced over at Sarah, who was staring out the window, her face expressionless. She had no idea. She had no idea about the affair, no idea about what was happening at work, no idea that their entire life was hanging by a thread. As they pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant, Daniel took a deep breath. Tonight, he would smile. He would make small talk. He would pretend that everything was normal. But deep down, he knew that nothing was normal any more than noose tightens. The dinner was a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversation. As Daniel sat across from Sarah and her friends, his mind was far from the laughter and the small talk that filled the air. Each laugh felt disconnected, every exchange meaningless. He could see their mouths moving, but he heard none of it. His thoughts were elsewhere, circling around the fragile hold he had on his career, the weight of Captain Lee's warning, and the suffocating dread of what might happen if his past mistakes were uncovered. Sarah, ever the consummate hostess, engaged her friends in conversation, while Daniel sipped his drink, nodding absent-mindedly when prompted. He knew she could sense his distance, but at this point, it had become a familiar pattern in their marriage. Years of growing apart had created a comfortable silence between them, one neither of them dared to break. Their relationship had become a routine, just like his job, just like his patrols, an empty shell that they both carried without acknowledging its hollowness. But tonight, the tension in Daniel's mind was different. It wasn't just about their marriage. It was about his life unraveling in ways he couldn't control. He had always believed he could manage his mistakes, that he could navigate the gray areas of his life without consequence. But now, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. When the dinner finally ended, Daniel was relieved to escape. Sarah's friends said their goodbyes with smiles and polite nods. But as soon as they were out of sight, the silence between Daniel and Sarah settled back in, heavier than before. The drive home was quiet, the space between them filled with the unspoken words that had built up over the years. As they pulled into the driveway, Sarah finally broke the silence. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Daniel exhaled, staring out at the darkened street ahead. He could feel her eyes on him, waiting for an answer. He wanted to tell her, wanted to unload the weight of everything that was pressing down on him, but he knew he couldn't. How could he explain the mounting pressure at work, the affair with Claire, the precarious balance he was trying to maintain in his life? "It's just work," he said, his voice tight. "Things have been tough with the new captain. He's coming down hard on everyone." Sarah was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. She nodded slowly, but there was something in her expression that told him she wasn't satisfied with the answer. "Is that it?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching his face. Daniel turned to look at her, feeling the tension coil tighter inside him. He knew she deserved more, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her the whole truth. Not about work, not about Claire, not about anything. "Yeah," he lied, forcing a smile. "That's it." Sarah's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she sighed and turned to open the car door. They'd walked into the house in silence, the distance between them more palpable than ever. Once inside, Sarah went straight to the bedroom without another word, leaving Daniel standing alone in the dimly lit living room. He stared after her for a moment, feeling the weight of his lies, the pressure of everything he was hiding. But instead of following her, he sank into the couch and buried his face in his hands. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from the darkness of his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting another reminder from work or a message from a colleague, but his breath caught when he saw the name on the screen. Claire. His pulse quickened as he stared at the message. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks. After their last meeting, Daniel had distanced himself, knowing that the affair was a dangerous game. But now, seeing her name flash across the screen, the guilt he had buried came rushing back. He hesitated for a moment before opening the message. "We need to talk. Meet me at the hotel tomorrow. It's important." Daniel's heart sank. He had known this was coming, had known that their affair couldn't stay hidden forever. But now, the urgency in her message made the situation all the more real. He stared at the screen, debating whether to respond or not. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend that this chapter of his life was over. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Claire was a complication he couldn't avoid, not anymore. If she wanted to meet, it meant something had changed, something he needed to know. With a heavy sigh, he typed a reply. "Okay, tomorrow." As soon as he sent the message, regret washed over him. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and stood up, pacing the living room as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had thought he could handle it all, the affair, the job, the lies. But now it was clear that everything was catching up to him, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it all from unraveling. The next morning, Daniel's anxiety returned with a vengeance. As he got dressed for work, he tried to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that followed him. He had a full shift ahead, but all he could think about was the impending meeting with Claire. What could she possibly have to say that was so important? And why now? His mind was racing with questions as he drove to the precinct, but when he arrived, he was immediately greeted by an even more unsettling surprise. Captain Lee was waiting for him. The moment Daniel walked through the doors, he saw Lee standing near the front desk, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. For a split second, Daniel's heart nearly stopped. Was this it? Had Lee somehow found out about Claire? Was this the day everything came crashing down? "Stone," Lee called, his voice commanding attention. "My office." Daniel felt his stomach drop. He nodded, his throat dry, and followed Lee down the hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last, and with each passing moment, his fear grew. The short walk to the captain's office felt like a lifetime, and when Lee finally opened the door and gestured for Daniel to sit, he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. Lee sat behind his desk, his expression as calm and controlled as ever. He folded his hands in front of him and fixed Daniel with a steely gaze. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation from last week," Lee began, his voice measured. "I've been keeping an eye on your performance, and I have some concerns." Daniel's heart raced. This was it, the reckoning. He struggled to maintain a neutral expression, but the anxiety clawing at his chest was impossible to ignore. "I understand, sir," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I've been trying to do better." Lee didn't respond immediately. He simply studied Daniel for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking again. "That's good to hear," Lee said, though his tone remained cool. "But understand this. I'm not giving you any more second chances. One more mistake, and you're done." The weight of Lee's words hit Daniel like a freight train. He nodded, swallowing hard as the reality of the situation settled in. He was on borrowed time. Any misstep, no matter how small, and his career would be over. "You can go," Lee said, dismissing him with a wave. Daniel stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. He left the office without another word, the fear of losing everything hanging over him like a storm cloud. But even as the weight of Lee's warning pressed down on him, Daniel's mind was already shifting to the other looming threat, the meeting with Claire. As the hours dragged on, the tension inside him built, every minute bringing him closer to the confrontation he had been dreading. When his shift finally ended, Daniel wasted no time. He drove straight to the hotel where he and Claire had met so many times before, his mind racing with questions and fears. He pulled into the parking lot and sat in his car for a moment, gathering his thoughts before finally stepping out and making his way inside. The room was exactly as he remembered it, dimly lit, with the familiar scent of cheap air freshener lingering in the air. Claire was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed, her face a mixture of worry and something else that Daniel couldn't quite place. "You came," she said softly as he closed the door behind him. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "What's going on, Claire? Why did you want to meet?" Claire hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a vulnerability that made Daniel's heart sink. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something that could ruin everything." Daniel's blood ran cold. The noose that had been tightening around his neck suddenly felt unbearable. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. "Someone knows about us, Daniel." The spiral. Daniel felt the ground beneath him shift as Claire's words sank in. His throat tightened, his mind racing. He stood frozen, staring at her, every nerve in his body suddenly on high alert. The walls of the small hotel room seemed to close in, and the air between them thickened with tension. "Someone knows," he repeated, his voice shaky. "Who? How?" Claire didn't meet his eyes. She ran her hands through her hair, a nervous habit Daniel had come to recognize over the course of their affair. She seemed on the verge of breaking down, the confident exterior she had always maintained now crumbling in front of him. "I don't know who exactly," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I found this yesterday." She reached into her bag, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. Daniel stared at it, his stomach churning as she handed it to him. With trembling hands, he unfolded it, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside was a single photograph. It was a grainy but unmistakable image of him and Claire entering this very hotel. The photo was slightly blurred, taken from a distance, but the identities of the people in it were clear. There was no denying it. Someone had been watching them. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who could have taken this? And why now? He had been so careful, hadn't he? Or at least he had thought he had been. But the evidence was staring back at him, undeniable and damning. "What? What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this?" Claire looked at him, fear etched into her face. "It was slipped under my door yesterday morning. No note, no explanation, just the photo." The world around Daniel seemed to blur as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had known this day might come, had known deep down that their affair couldn't stay hidden forever, but he had never imagined it would unfold like this. Now his career, his marriage, his entire life, everything was hanging by a thread, and he had no idea who was holding the scissors. "We need to figure out who did this," Claire continued, her voice trembling. "I don't know if they're planning to expose us, or if this is some kind of warning, but we can't ignore it." Daniel could barely think straight. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and his thoughts raced wildly. He felt cornered, trapped in a situation with no clear escape. The immediate thought that crossed his mind was Captain Lee. He had already been watching Daniel closely, scrutinizing his every move. Could this be part of a larger plan to push him out? Had Lee somehow found out about the affair and was now using it against him? The idea chilled him to the bone. But if it wasn't Lee, who could it be? Who would go through the trouble of following them, taking pictures, and slipping the evidence under Claire's door? "We have to stop this before it gets out," Daniel said, finally finding his voice. "I can't let this get to Lee. If he finds out, it's over for me. You know that." Claire nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I know. But what do we do? We don't even know who's behind this." Daniel rubbed his temples, trying to think clearly. Every moment in this hotel room felt like a ticking time bomb. His entire life was at risk, and he knew that the wrong move could set off a chain reaction that would destroy everything. "I'll handle it," Daniel said, though he had no idea how. "We just need to keep calm. We can't let anyone know we're panicking. If we act normal, maybe whoever's behind this will slip up." Claire looked at him, uncertainty clouding her face. And if they don't? Daniel had no answer for that. He was grasping at straws, hoping that he could somehow get control of the situation before it spiraled completely out of his reach. But deep down, he knew it might already be too late. As they sat in the quiet of the hotel room, the weight of the silence between them grew. There were no more reassurances left to offer, no easy solutions, only fear and the looming threat of exposure. After a long, tense pause, Claire spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's my husband?" Daniel's blood ran cold at the suggestion. Claire's husband, Officer Tom Carter, worked in the same precinct as Daniel. He was a man Daniel had tried to avoid ever since the affair started, keeping his interactions with him as minimal and professional as possible. The thought that Carter could be behind the photograph sent a wave of panic through Daniel's chest. But it made sense. Who else had the motive? Carter wasn't a fool. Maybe he had grown suspicious. Maybe he had followed them and taken the photo himself. The idea that Carter knew was terrifying. If he had proof of the affair, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for Daniel's career, but for his safety. "Has he said anything to you?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with dread. Claire shook her head. "No, he's been acting normal. But, you know Tom, he doesn't show his cards. If he knows, he won't say anything until it's too late." Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. Carter was known for his calm, methodical nature. If he had discovered the affair, there was no telling how he might react. Would he confront them, or would he go straight to Captain Lee? The uncertainty was maddening. "We have to assume he knows," Daniel said, his voice grim. "We have to prepare for the worst." Claire looked pale, her hands trembling slightly. "What if he comes after you?" Daniel didn't answer. The thought had crossed his mind, but he didn't want to dwell on it. Carter was the kind of man who played the long game. He wouldn't act impulsively, but that didn't make him any less dangerous. If anything, it made him more so. "I'll figure something out," Daniel said, though the words felt hollow. "For now, we need to lay low. Don't contact me unless it's an emergency. We can't let anyone see us together." Claire nodded, though her fear was palpable. "What are you going to do?" Daniel didn't have an answer. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind spinning with possible strategies. He needed to figure out who was behind the photograph and what their next move might be. But as the walls of his life began to close in, Daniel felt more trapped than ever. "I'll talk to some people," he said finally. "See if I can get any leads. But for now, we have to be careful." Claire stood up as well, her eyes filled with worry. She reached out and touched his arm, her voice soft. "Daniel, I'm scared." He looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. He was scared too. But he couldn't show it. Not now. He had to keep control or everything would fall apart. "I know," he said quietly, "but we'll get through this." They both knew it was a lie, but it was the only thing he could offer. As they left the hotel, Daniel's mind was a whirlwind of panic and fear. Every step felt like it brought him closer to the edge of a cliff, with no idea how far the drop would be. His life was unraveling, and the threads were slipping faster than he could catch them. He drove back to his house in silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. When he pulled into the driveway, Sarah's car was already there, the lights in the house glowing softly in the evening light. The weight of the situation pressed down on him as he sat in the car, staring at the front door. How much longer could he keep this hidden? How much longer until everything came crashing down? He didn't know, but as he stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, he knew one thing for certain. The noose was tightening, and there was no escaping it now. The fall. The next few days passed in a haze for Daniel. Every minute felt like a countdown, a ticking clock toward the inevitable. He went through the motions at work, but the tension in his chest never left. Every interaction with his colleagues felt strained, especially with Officer Tom Carter, Claire's husband. Carter seemed to be everywhere, and every time Daniel crossed paths with him, the paranoia twisted deeper into his gut. Carter was cordial as always, his stoic face revealing nothing. But to Daniel, every glance felt like a threat, every word like a veiled accusation. Was Carter the one behind the photo? Did he know about the affair? Was he waiting for the right moment to ruin Daniel's life? By midweek, the pressure became unbearable. Daniel felt like he was drowning, the weight of his lies and secrets pressing him deeper into despair. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, fearing that someone, anyone, would confront him about the affair, about the photograph, about everything he had tried so hard to hide. And then, one afternoon, it all came crashing down. It started with a summons to Captain Lee's office. Daniel's stomach twisted the moment he saw the message pop up on his computer screen. The terse request was simple. Stone, my office. Now. The short walk from his desk to Lee's office felt like a march toward his own execution. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had Carter told Lee? Was Lee finally ready to pull the trigger on Daniel's career? Or worse, had the photograph surfaced, leaving Daniel exposed? When Daniel entered the office, Captain Lee was already seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. There was no family photo today, no small talk. The air in the room was thick with tension, and Daniel could feel the heavy weight of it as soon as he stepped inside. "Shut the door," Lee said in a tone that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Daniel obeyed, closing the door with a soft click before taking a seat. His heart was racing, his palms damp with sweat. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end. Lee stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, the silence between them stretching unbearably. And then, without warning, he slid a file across the desk toward Daniel. "Do you recognize this?" Daniel's stomach dropped as he looked down at the file. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing the same photograph Claire had shown him at the hotel. The grainy image of the two of them walking into the hotel was undeniable, and now it was sitting in front of him, staring up like a death sentence. The blood drained from his face. This was it. This was the moment everything collapsed. "Captain, I can explain," Daniel stammered, but his voice was weak, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "It's not what it looks like." Lee cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand, his face cold and impassive. "Save it," he said, his voice hard as steel. "I've heard enough excuses in my time, Stone. And this," he gestured to the photo, "this is not something you can explain away." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt like a cornered animal, his mind racing for some way out, but there was none. Lee knew, and now there was no denying the truth. "You lied to me," Lee continued, his voice low but filled with controlled fury. "I gave you a second chance, and you spat in my face. I should have trusted my gut the first time we spoke, but I gave you the benefit of the doubt. That was a mistake." "Please, Captain," Daniel begged, desperation clawing at his voice. "I can fix this. It was a mistake." Enough," Lee barked, slamming his hand down on the desk. The sudden burst of anger made Daniel flinch. "You think I care about your excuses? You've been carrying on with a colleague's wife behind his back. You've disgraced this department, this badge, and everything it stands for." Daniel's head spun, the full weight of Lee's words crashing down on him. His affair with Claire, his lies, his reckless behavior, it had all led him here, to this moment of reckoning. He could feel everything he had worked for slipping away, crumbling beneath him. But the worst was yet to come. Lee's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did you think Tom wouldn't find out?" Daniel's heart stopped. His blood turned to ice. Tom. Officer Tom Carter. Claire's husband. What? Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. His mind couldn't process the words. He stared at Lee, his breath shallow, his body frozen in shock. Lee's gaze was piercing, unrelenting. Tom found out weeks ago, Stone. He came to me. We've been watching you ever since. He wanted to handle this privately, but I convinced him to let me take the lead. And now here we are. Daniel's vision blurred, his pulse thundering in his ears. Tom knew. He had known all along. The photograph, the mounting pressure. This had been a trap, a carefully laid snare, and Daniel had walked right into it. He felt sick, bile rising in his throat as the full weight of the betrayal settled over him. What? What is going to happen? Daniel asked, his voice trembling. He was barely able to keep himself upright, his body feeling as if it might collapse under the strain. Lee leaned back in his chair, his face calm, almost eerily so. You're done here, Stone, he said quietly. You're finished. You'll hand in your badge and your gun by the end of the day. I'm going to make sure you're stripped of everything, and I'm going to see to it that you never work in law enforcement again. You don't deserve this uniform. Daniel's vision tunneled as the reality of Lee's words hit him. His career, his life, it was over. The power, the authority he had once wielded with such confidence had evaporated in an instant. The badge that had made him feel invincible now felt like a weight around his neck, dragging him down into the abyss. And as for Tom, Lee continued, his voice even colder, I convinced him not to press charges. He doesn't want to see your life destroyed. He just wants you gone. Daniel couldn't speak. His mouth was dry, his mind numb with shock. This was worse than anything he had imagined. He had thought he could control the situation, but now everything was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Get out of my office, Lee said, his voice final, and don't come back. Daniel stood up on unsteady legs, his body numb, his mind reeling. He felt like he was moving through a nightmare, every step heavy, the weight of his downfall pressing down on him. As he walked out of the office, the world around him felt surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. The faces of his colleagues blurred as he made his way through the precinct, each glance filled with judgment, with pity, with contempt. By the time he reached his desk, he could barely breathe. He grabbed his badge and his gun, his hand shaking as he placed them on the desk. It felt like a final act of surrender, like laying down his last bit of dignity. And then, without looking back, he left. The ride home was a blur, the world outside the window a swirl of colors and lights that meant nothing. His mind was numb, his thoughts jumbled, his future an empty void. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was gone. His career, his marriage, his life. It had all unraveled in a matter of weeks, and now there was nothing left. When Daniel pulled into his driveway, the house he shared with Sarah stood eerily quiet. The lights were off, and the darkness inside seemed to mirror the void in his chest. He didn't know how to face her, didn't know how to explain the mess he had made of their lives. As he stepped out of the car, the weight of his failures crushed him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the house, unsure of what to do, where to go. The silence around him was deafening, and for the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly lost. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs, but it did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. Then, with a sense of finality, he walked up the steps to the front door and opened it. And just like that, Daniel Stone's life came crashing down. The choices he had made, the lies he had told, had finally caught up with him. The affair, the abuse of power, the arrogance, it had all led him to this moment of reckoning. He had lost everything, and now all that was left was the long, dark road of consequences. There would be no escape. The end had come.